Okay, let's unpack this. Here's a really striking global reality presented in the material we're diving into today. Over 70% of the world's population, that's what, 5.7 billion people, lives under autocratic rule.
It's a staggering figure, really.
It is. And here's the kicker. Liberal democracies, like yours perhaps, often find themselves needing to work directly with the security forces within these systems. It's often not really a choice.
A geopolitical necessity sometimes.
Exactly, to pursue important foreign policy and security objectives. But, as you can imagine, that engagement comes with immense challenges and some pretty serious, often kind of hidden dangers.
For sure.
Welcome to a deep dive into a really complex topic, all based on the material you provided. We're looking specifically at the risks and maybe the possibilities when external actors think governments from liberal democracies provide support to security organizations operating within authoritarian regimes, specifically during peacetime.
Right. The focus is peacetime engagement.
Our mission today is to try and cut through some of that complexity, identify the core risks inherent in this kind of engagement, as outlined in this analysis, understand why they exist, and explore how the material suggests they can potentially be assessed and managed. And we're sticking strictly to the information in this source material.
Think of it as your shortcut, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Your shortcut to getting genuinely well-informed on this incredibly tricky subject.
And what I think is so valuable about this analysis is that it gives us a framework. We're going to explore the layers of risk it identifies, starting right from the fundamental nature of authoritarianism itself, moving through how security is organized within those systems, and then getting down into the more, practical, granular details, things like program design, the specific type of support offered, and even the sensitivity of the particular security issue you're trying to address. It breaks it down.
Great. So let's kick off by really setting the stage with the global reality this material highlights. It points out that 71% of the world's population lives under autocratic systems.
71%.
Yeah, contrast that with only 29% living in democratic systems. That's just a massive imbalance in where people are living globally.
It really is.
And while the number of democratic countries, 91, is actually quite close to the number of autocratic countries, 88, it's the sheer number of people under authoritarian rule that dominates the global picture.
And what's particularly fascinating, or maybe worrying here, is that this isn't static. The analysis shows the number of people living under authoritarian rule has increased by a dramatic 48% in just the last 10 years.
Wow, 48% in a decade.
Yeah, that's a huge shift in a relatively short period.
Almost half more people under autocratic rule.
Yeah.
So this prevalence means democratic countries simply must engage with authoritarian systems if they have any foreign policy or security interests there.
Pretty much, yeah. The material makes it pretty clear that taking the moral high ground and simply not engaging isn't always a luxury democracies can afford.
Right, especially given the significant overlap the material highlights between authoritarian countries and what are often termed fragile states. And how authoritarian governance frequently co-occurs with conflict and negative impacts. Things like extremism, organized crime, refugee flows that can easily spill over globally. You can't just ignore it.
You really can't just put a fence around these problems, no.
Yeah.
And the material isn't monolithic about authoritarianism, which is important. It crucially differentiates between types of autocracy, which it argues is vital for assessing risk.
Okay, what are the types?
Well, it says about 44% of the world's population, roughly 3.5 billion people, live in what it calls electoral autocracies.
Electoral autocracies. Okay.
These are systems that do have multi-party elections for the executive, but the analysis is very clear that they are neither free nor fair, and freedom of expression is limited. It gives examples like populous countries such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, the Philippines, Turkey.
Okay, so they maintain the veneer of democracy with elections, but without the substance, really, of actual freedom and fairness. Does the material say that makes engagement any different?
It does. It suggests that in these electoral autocracies, the regime's security priorities might be less starkly regime-centered compared to, say, more closed systems. This potentially offers a slightly better chance for finding synergies with people-centered security priorities, though, it's still an uphill battle.
A potential sliver of opportunity, maybe? A bit more wiggle room?
Perhaps, a little. However, about 27% of the world's population, around 2.2 billion people, live in closed autocracies.
Right.
Here, according to the analysis, there's no facade of political dissent tolerance or multi-party elections. Civil rights are curbed far more severely. Examples include countries like China, Iran, Myanmar, Vietnam, Libya, South Sudan, Yemen.
That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
Fewer avenues for any kind of reform or transparency, I suppose. And the material also mentions this dynamic of regime transformation countries moving towards or away from democracy.
Yes, and the analysis highlights that autocratization moving away from democracy is currently the stronger wave globally. It involves 42 countries and impacts some 2.8 billion people, with countries like India significantly contributing to that population count just because of its size.
So countries are actually becoming more authoritarian. That's the trend.
That's the trend the analysis identifies, yeah. But it raises an interesting point for external actors considering engagement. The material suggests that countries currently undergoing liberalization, so moving towards democracy, or even those electoral democracies that are currently autocratizing, might offer situations where risks are somewhat reduced compared to stable, closed autocracies, and where opportunities for positive impact are potentially increased. There might be more flux, more churn.
And maybe more leverage points.
Potentially, yes. More possibility.
Okay, so you can definitely see why engaging with authoritarian systems is often seen as necessary by democracies, given this whole global landscape. But the very environment, the prevalence, the nature, the dynamics of authoritarianism presents the first fundamental layer of challenge. It's the complex backdrop everything else plays out against.
Absolutely. And it's against this backdrop that the analysis we're looking at distinguishes 5 levels of risk when providing external security support.
5 levels. Okay, and this is a crucial distinction the material makes. 2 of these levels are considered strategic risks. Can you explain that?
Yeah, these are described as fundamental challenges stemming directly from the nature of authoritarian systems themselves. The analysis is really clear. You largely have to, well, to a significant extent, politically accept these risks if you choose to engage.
Accept them. So you can't really mitigate them.
Not significantly, no. They are likely to occur at some point, regardless of how brilliantly you design your support program. They're inherent.
Okay, inherent risks. And the other 3?
The other 3 levels are operational risks. These relate more to the practical aspects of designing and implementing the support programs.
The doing part.
Exactly. The analysis suggests these can be managed, theoretically, though it heavily caveats that. It says success depends critically on the creativity, the political savviness, and the capabilities of the external actors involved.
So no guarantee, but there's potential for management there.
Right. There's potential, yeah.
Okay, let's dive into each layer then, starting with those strategic risks that are, in essence, kind of the cost of entry when you decide to work in these environments.
Right. So, layer 1. This first layer of risk comes directly from the fundamental nature of authoritarianism itself. The analysis finds that external support for security organizations in these systems faces significant inherent problems, regardless of the specific type of authoritarianism or how well the support is designed.
Okay, so what's the first big one?
The first risk within this layer is what the material terms the core priority risk. It points out that the security organizations in these systems always have regime interests as their core priority.
Always.
Always. What's often called state-centered security, getting them to also genuinely serve people-centered security priorities, well, it's an uphill battle.
So protecting the regime versus protecting the people.
Exactly. The analysis suggests any benefits for ordinary people are likely to be marginal most of the time. The root issue, it says, isn't just the organizations themselves, but the authoritarian regime that directs them.
Right.
This creates risks of fundamental inefficiency and irrelevance for external support initiatives. Your well-intentioned training or equipment might just end up being used for regime protection or simply have minimal impact on the real security problems faced by the population.
That feels like a pretty fundamental constraint, a huge one.
It is. And linked to that is the fragility risk. The analysis argues that authoritarian systems, by their nature, are inherently fragile.
Fragile? How so?
Well, they can face protests, internal power struggles, economic shocks, other crises at any moment that could tip them into extended political violence or even civil war.
Okay.
If that happens, the material says, security organizations are likely to shift from a peacetime role to a wartime mode almost overnight, deepening their focus on regime survival above all else.
So any program you had running just goes out the window.
Pretty much. This creates the risk of instant and terminal failure of any external support you were providing. Your program objectives become completely moot.
And I guess there's the serious risk of reputational damage too, right?
Yeah.
if your support is seen to have somehow contributed to the regime's use of force against its own people during a crisis like that.
Absolutely. Huge reputational risk. And then there's the undeniable human rights risk. The analysis states that serious human rights violations must be expected when supporting security organizations operating under authoritarian conditions.
Must be expected. That's stark.
It is. It's not presented as just an unfortunate side effect. Authoritarian governance, by definition, relies partly on repression to maintain control, so violations occur regularly. The material notes the intensity varies based on factors like social inequality, the specific composition of the regime, the type of threat the regime perceives, but the risk is constant.
And this poses a risk of significant reputational damage for external supporters.
Definitely. And the analysis even notes the potential, in some cases, for actual liability.
Okay, so these level 1 risks, the core priority issue, the inherent fragility and the human rights problems are, according to the material, so deeply linked to the very DNA of authoritarianism itself.
Yeah, baked in.
That they cannot be significantly reduced or mitigated through clever program design or specific choices about who within the security apparatus you work with. They are essentially strategic risks that you have to politically accept if you make the decision to engage in this environment at all.
Precisely. They shape the entire risk landscape right from the outset. Now, once you've, grappled with those fundamental risks, the second strategic layer the material identifies looks at how security is specifically structured and organized within that particular authoritarian system.
Okay, so moving beyond the general nature to the specifics of the system.
Exactly. The analysis suggests 2 key questions are particularly helpful here for assessing this layer of risk.
Okay, what are they?
First, does the regime have a near monopoly on the use of violence, or are coercive capabilities fragmented?
Fragmented meaning, like militias or powerful regional groups.
Yeah, exactly. Significant armed power held by multiple groups, not just the state. The analysis explains that if there's no near monopoly, then external support risks getting caught up in inter-elite tensions and power plays between these competing groups.
Right, you might inadvertently back the wrong horse or fuel conflict.
Potentially. If there is a near monopoly where the state controls most force, your support is more likely to risk becoming entangled in state-society tensions and conflicts, basically, the state versus its own population.
Okay.
The material gives examples. Countries like Iraq or Lebanon are presented as having no near monopoly on force, while Egypt or Niger are examples where the state is said to have a near monopoly.
Okay, so fragmented power leads to risks from internal elite squabbles. Consolidated power leads to risks from tensions with the population. Got it. What's the second question?
Second, which security institution is critical to regime survival?
Who keeps the regime in power?
Basically, yes. The analysis argues that if the regime relies mostly on the army to sustain itself, supporting the army automatically becomes a riskier proposition compared to supporting other security organizations.
Makes sense.
Conversely, if it depends more heavily on police and intelligence services for its survival, then those are the riskier ones to support. Examples provided in the material. The army is seen as key in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, and Mali. Police and intelligence are identified as key in places like Belarus and Cambodia.
So supporting the core pillar of regime power is inherently more fraught, more likely to implicate you in repression.
That's the idea. The material effectively presents this as a kind of simple matrix, based on the answers to those 2 questions, monopoly on violence, and which institution is key. You get a profile.
A risk profile for that specific country.
Yeah, indicating whether the primary risk focus needs to be on navigating intra-elite competition or state-society conflicts, and it identifies which specific institution within that system carries the highest risk.
Can you give an example?
Sure. For instance, in Myanmar, where the analysis suggests there's no near monopoly on force and the army is key to regime maintenance, external support must primarily focus on understanding and navigating intra-elite competition. And the army is identified as the highest risk institution to work with.
Okay.
In Egypt, contrastingly, where there is a near monopoly and the army is still key, support needs to primarily understand state-society conflicts, and the army remains the highest risk institution.
So this framework helps you map out the specific political terrain and identify the most dangerous actors or areas to potentially engage with.
Exactly. It helps focus the risk assessment. The analysis also delves a bit into why authoritarian rulers prioritize different security organizations. It suggests this is based on the dominant threat they perceive to their survival. Mass uprisings might lead them to prioritize the army, for its capacity for large-scale lethal violence.
Right.
Whereas managing dedicated resistance or, importantly, internal elite strife might lead them to prioritize police and intelligence for more targeted, covert violence.
Different tools for different perceived threats.
Precisely. And the way rulers try to mitigate the risk of a coup from their own powerful army, things like establishing Praetorian guards, organizing military commands geographically to prevent coordination, or using intelligence services to spy on their own officers, that also influences this risk landscape and needs to be understood.
Wow, that adds another layer of complexity to the internal security dynamics within the regime itself.
It does. And the analysis notes that regime legitimacy also plays a role. Higher legitimacy among the population, maybe through tradition or delivering economic benefits, can mean the regime needs to rely less on repressive violence to stay in power.
Makes sense. If people feel the regime is legitimate, less force is needed.
Right. It contrasts, for example, some Persian Gulf monarchies, which might rely less on violence due to a combination of traditional legitimacy and output legitimacy from distributing wealth. With situations like Bahrain in 2011, where significant wealth gaps between groups created grievances that required more repression to manage.
Okay, so the key takeaway for you here, pulling from this layer of the analysis, seems to be it's generally less risky to support security organizations that are not identified as critical to the regime's survival.
That's a key finding, yes.
And engaging on security issues, primarily at the state-society interface, like community policing maybe, might be viewed as more legitimate locally than getting involved in issues tied up in opaque intra-regime power dynamics.
That's another consideration the analysis raises, yeah. Local legitimacy matters.
Okay, so that covers the strategic risks, those big fundamental challenges you largely have to accept when deciding to engage with authoritarian security forces. Now, let's shift to the operational risks.
Right, the ones that the analysis suggests can theoretically be managed through good design and implementation, though, as we'll see, getting it right is far from easy.
And before we dive into those specific operational layers, the material points out some critical and frankly pretty flawed assumptions that external actors often make, which sound like they just set things up for failure.
They really can. One big one identified is pursuing your own external national interests, let's say. Reducing migration or fighting terrorism by working directly with authoritarian security forces who are laser-focused on regime priorities while entirely ignoring the need for people-centered security objectives.
So using them as a tool for your own ends, basically.
Kind of, yeah. The analysis is quite blunt. It says this might achieve short-term goals for the external actor, but it's likely to make the original problems worse in the long run.
How does it make things worse? That seems counterintuitive if you're trying to say, stop terrorism.
Because, the analysis explains, popular grievances inevitably mount when the very security forces you're supporting use heavy-handed, unaccountable tactics enabled, perhaps inadvertently, by your support. People resent it.
Oh, okay. Blowback.
Exactly. It can also have significant unintended negative effects. Like, maybe you provide border force support that meets your goal of reducing migration numbers, but it inadvertently harms the livelihoods of border populations who depend on cross-border trade, which then increases local instability and resentment.
That feels like a classic case of solving the wrong problem, or maybe only half the problem, with potentially counterproductive results down the line.
Precisely. Another flawed assumption the material points out is believing that simply having better institutions automatically leads to better security for the population.
You mean like better laws, better structures?
Yeah, providing good training, better equipment, improving legal frameworks. The analysis says that's not enough if the organizational incentives within that authoritarian system, especially at senior leadership levels, aren't actually aligned with the goals of improvement towards people-centered security.
Right. You can build a shiny new system, but if the people running it are incentivized to maintain the status quo or serve the regime's interests above all else, it won't really change anything for the average person on the ground.
Exactly. The structures might look better on paper, but the function remains the same. And critically, the analysis emphasizes that serious efforts to improve people-centered security must include the views of local communities themselves on what their main security issues actually are.
Bottom-up perspective.
Yes. If, for example, a border force is involved in smuggling networks with ties to powerful elites, which the material points out is often an issue rooted in the local political economy, not just bad apples, then just giving that border force more capacity building or equipment won't change much. It could even increase instability or corruption unless those deep-seated elite interests and power structures are somehow addressed in the external intervention, which is incredibly difficult.
So operational risks are massively increased from the get-go if external actors come in with these kinds of blind spots or flawed assumptions. Which brings us neatly to the third layer of risk, and the first truly operational one. Design, design, and more design.
Yes. This layer focuses squarely on the risk of program failure due to faulty design and our poor implementation. This is where the possibility of management comes in, but the analysis stresses it requires a lot of skill, political understanding, and adherence to known good practices.
Okay, and the good news the material offers here is that decades of experience in security sector support, or SSR, have actually generated a pretty solid understanding of what features make programs more likely to succeed in complex, politically challenging environments like these.
That's right. There is a body of knowledge. The analysis lists 10 key indicators of good design. A program, it says, should ideally feature as many of these elements as possible to have a better chance.
Okay, let's hear some of them. What makes for good design in this context?
Well, for example, the analysis says programs need to be capable of engaging politically on a daily basis, not just technically.
Politically, what does that mean?
It means understanding and interacting with the deep-seated politics of change or resistance to change in the system, having a clear political strategy for the intervention, and strong political analysis capability among the staff on the ground, not just being technical experts.
Right. And critically, they need to be long-term.
Yes, ideally 6 to 10 years, the analysis suggests. That's needed to realistically build relationships, build trust, and actually understand the often slow-moving impacts in these complex systems. Short-term projects, 2 or 3 years, are just unlikely to move the needle on deep-seated issues.
Okay. Long-term and politically savvy. What is?
The analysis also points out that for what it calls wicked problems common in these environments, where the problem and the solution aren't fully known upfront, good programs should plan to develop a clearer understanding of results and adapt their approach during implementation.
So, not sticking rigidly to the initial plan if it's not working.
Exactly. Using insights gained on the ground to refine what they're doing, which, naturally, requires programs to be flexible in using funds, time, and staff, allowing resources to be shifted based on those evolving insights, rather than being locked into rigid plans made years in advance.
That sounds sensible, but probably hard to do with bureaucratic funding cycles.
Very hard, often. And this flexibility needs to be informed by continuous learning. The analysis stresses the importance of regularly monitoring activities, not just ticking boxes, but proper stakeholder analysis and adjusting based on what is actually working or not working.
Learning as you go.
Yes, and benefiting from recurrent political economy and political settlement analysis to understand shifts in power structures and resource flows that inevitably impact the program. Who's gaining? Who's losing? How is power shifting?
Okay. What about the people involved?
On the staffing side, the material highlights the need for sufficient numbers of professional staff on the ground, covering a mix of expertise: political diplomatic skills to navigate the system, development practice expertise, and specific technical knowledge related to policing, defense, justice, whatever the focus area is, not just one type of expert.
Right. And good design also means combining an institutional focus, working to improve security organizations, with a focus on actual security problems as defined by communities themselves.
Yes, that link is crucial. And then figuring out if the institutions you're supporting can or will realistically address those community-defined problems, not just assuming they will because you've given them training.
And for navigating the sensitive political terrain, the analysis suggests using conditionality sparingly, linking aid to specific reforms.
Yeah, it finds that often doesn't work well in these highly controlled contexts. Instead, it emphasizes the importance of including recurrent informed dialogues at different levels, talking regularly with counterparts.
Dialogue instead of demands.
Pretty much. And crucially, creating avenues for popular participation like community committees or working with local NGOs to discuss security issues and provide feedback directly, giving people a voice.
And finally, for programs where support is outsourced, maybe to private contractors or NGOs.
Yes, The material says there needs to be solid supervision. Funders the government's providing the money need deep knowledge of the context, strong diplomatic ability, and sufficient time and funding to provide genuine oversight. Not just treating it as a box-ticking exercise handled by a single, possibly junior desk officer juggling many files back in the Capitol.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive list of what good design looks like based on decades of experience.
Yeah.
But here's the striking point the material makes about this layer, right?
Right.
Despite these known good practices, they often don't get followed.
That's the core issue highlighted, yes.
Yeah.
External security support programs often remain short-term, maybe just 2 to 4 years, severely understaffed, fundamentally apolitical in their approach despite the political context, burdened by unrealistic expectations from back home, and, critically, disconnected from local power realities and political dynamics on the ground.
Why? If we know it works better, why does this keep happening?
The analysis points to several reasons. Short-term political goals back home for the external actors wanting quick results, maybe a lack of professionalism or capacity in some funding and implementing organizations, and sometimes a narrow view of value for money that focuses solely on easily measurable outputs or low costs rather than achieving complex long-term results in challenging environments.
So the risk here is significant and, the analysis implies, frequently realized. Major level 3 operational risks of failure due to poor design continue to plague much external security support precisely because these fundamental design principles, though known, aren't consistently followed.
Exactly. It's presented as a risk that could theoretically be managed with skill, resources, and political will, but often isn't.
Okay. So moving on from design, the type of support offered also carries different levels of risk, according to the material. This is the 4th operational risk layer.
Yes. The specific what you provide matters too.
And the material provides a kind of general range, right, from lower to higher risk activities.
It does. On the lower end, it lists things like support for developing legislative frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and budgets within the security sector. Strategic and policy advice is also generally seen as lower risk.
More upstream activities.
Kind of, yeah. Also, non-lethal tactical training or providing non-lethal equipment and infrastructure, think vehicles, buildings, communication systems.
Okay, lower risk. What's in the middle?
In the mid-range, the analysis places things like on-the-job coaching or mentoring for personnel, efforts to professionalize military or police academies, and intelligence cooperation.
Intelligence cooperation.
Yeah.
That feels like it could be risky.
It's placed mid-range, suggesting it's riskier than policy advice, but perhaps less directly risky than providing weapons, depending on the nature of the cooperation, of course.
Right. And on the higher risk end.
That's where you find lethal tactical training, including preparation for peacekeeping operations where they might use lethal force, and, of course, providing lethal equipment, weapons, ammunition.
Okay, the risk there seems pretty self-evident, doesn't it? Giving the means to cause harm in a system that's fundamentally built on repression or potentially fragile is inherently more dangerous than helping them write a budget or offering policy advice.
That's the core logic, yes. The potential for misuse or negative consequences is much higher. However, the analysis also notes that combining different types of support can potentially alter the risk profile.
How so?
For example, combining lethal training with robust non-lethal training on the laws of war, human rights standards, and effective on-the-job coaching and oversight might collectively reduce the risk of civilian harm compared to just providing lethal training in isolation.
So packaging support smartly might mitigate some risk.
Potentially, yes. And the material also mentions that working together with other external actors, maybe in mini or multilateral configurations, can potentially reduce risks.
Safety in numbers.
Sort of. By increasing collective political influence and leverage, you might have more sway. But that's only provided there's a genuinely shared strategy and approach among the external parties involved, which isn't always easy to achieve.
Okay. So that's layer 4. The type of support matters. What's the final operational risk layer?
The 5th and final operational risk layer, according to the material, comes down to the specific topic or theme of the security issue you intend to work on.
The subject matter itself.
Exactly. And this isn't a fixed list of high or low risk topics globally. Its risk profile depends entirely on its political sensitivity within that specific authoritarian system you're working in.
So context is everything again.
Absolutely. The analysis stresses you absolutely have to assess this locally and on a case-by-case basis. What might be a relatively safe topic in one country could be political dynamite in another.
So what might be low risk in one place could be high risk somewhere else, even if it's the same general issue.
Exactly, but the material does give some examples of issues that tend to have a lower risk profile because they're often relatively non-political, although they might still be culturally sensitive.
Like what?
It mentions things like support for addressing domestic or sexual violence, improving general street safety, and maybe community security initiatives focused on local crime prevention.
Issues that are more focused on everyday citizen safety rather than state power or control.
Generally, yes. Other topics are likely to be more politically sensitive and thus carry a higher risk profile. Examples given include issues like land appropriation, border control, managing people flows like migration or refugees, and tackling smuggling.
Why are those higher risk?
Because they often directly touch on sensitive issues of state sovereignty, power, resource control, and who benefits or loses within the system. There are often powerful vested interests involved.
Right. And then there are topics that the material suggests are almost certainly political non-starters for external support most of the time. Things you probably shouldn't even try to touch.
Yes. These are issues directly related to regime control and internal power dynamics. Think about trying to provide external support on how the regime deals with political dissent.
Yeah, probably not going to happen.
Or getting involved in issues related to recruitment, promotion, and pay within the security forces themselves. That's usually seen as core internal business.
Too close to the bone. Too close to the core levers of regime survival and control.
Exactly. The analysis is clear. Understanding this specific local political sensitivity of the issue you want to work on is crucial for gauging the associated risks of engagement. You might have a brilliantly designed program, low layer 3 risk, providing a lower risk type of support like policy advice, low layer 4 risk, but if it's on a highly sensitive topic, high layer 5 risk, the overall operational risk could still be very high and the program could fail or backfire.
Okay. So we've walked through these 5 layers now. The 2 big strategic risks inherent in the nature of authoritarianism and the specific organization of security within it.
Levels 1 and 2.
And then the 3 operational risks related to program design, the type of support provided, and the specific issue's political sensitivity.
Levels 3, 4, and 5. Right.
How does the material suggest external actors actually use this framework? It's not just an academic exercise, right?
No, definitely not. That's the key. The analysis presents these 5 layers as a practical framework for conducting a structured risk assessment before and during engagement.
Okay.
It outlines the concept of doing maybe a quick scan using these layers for getting a rough initial risk profile and flags the need for a more thorough, in-depth assessment when considering more significant or longer-term engagement.
So it's not just a list of problems, it's presented as a tool for decision-making.
Exactly. The value of this framework, according to the analysis, is that it allows for a more evidence-based decision on whether responsible engagement is even possible at all in a given situation.
Responsible engagement, meaning engagement that's likely to do more good than harm.
Essentially, yes. Or at least engagement where the risks are understood and deemed acceptable relative to the potential benefits. It helps external actors compare the generated risk profile, looking across all 5 layers, against the anticipated benefits they hope to gain from the intervention.
Okay, so walk me through that. You look at the strategic risks, layers 1 and 2.
Yeah, the nature of the regime, how its security is set up.
To assess if the fundamental risks of engaging in this specific authoritarian system are politically acceptable to you as the external actor, given whatever benefits you hope to achieve.
Exactly. Are you willing to accept the high likelihood of your support being somewhat irrelevant to people's needs, the potential for sudden failure if the regime faces a crisis, the constant reputational damage risk, and the unavoidable human rights concerns? Is the potential gain worth accepting those strategic realities?
That's a tough political calculation.
It absolutely is. And then, if you decide the strategic risks are acceptable, you look at the operational risks, layers 3, 4, and 5.
Design, type of support, topic sensitivity.
Right. And you use those to determine if, given those strategic constraints you've accepted, the intervention can actually be designed and targeted in a way that creates a manageable operational risk profile while still having some realistic chance of being effective and achieving its objectives.
So it's about figuring out if the operational risks can be brought down to a level that doesn't undermine the whole effort or cause unacceptable harm, always remembering those big strategic risks looming in the background.
Precisely. It provides a much more structured way to think through these incredibly difficult decisions than just, say, deciding based on a short-term foreign policy need or a vague general desire to do something or help.
It pushes for a more realistic assessment.
It's intended to push external actors beyond those flawed assumptions we talked about, and towards a much more clear-eyed assessment of the specific environment, the inherent dangers, and the likely outcomes of their actions.
So what does all of this mean for you listening to this? When you encounter news or analysis about international efforts to support security forces in countries like Egypt or Myanmar, Pakistan, or any of the others we mentioned,
Or read about challenges with training programs or equipment provision or advice on institutional reform.
this framework gives you a really powerful way to think critically about the inherent difficulties involved. It helps you look past the headlines, maybe.
It does. It helps you understand that it's not just about whether support is given or not. It's about the fundamental nature of the authoritarian context it's given in, level 1, how security is organized within that specific system, and who holds the power, level 2.
Right.
The quality and political savviness of the program's design and implementation, level 3. The specific type of support being offered. Is it just advice or is it weapons? Level 4. And the local political sensitivity of the actual security issue being addressed, level 5. All those layers matter.
This deep dive, based entirely on the material you shared, offers, I think, a much more nuanced understanding of these strategic tightrope democracies walk when they engage in these places, and the immense operational complexities involved in navigating the reality of a world that is, as we saw, largely authoritarian.
It provides a structure for assessing whether responsible engagement is even possible, and highlights just how challenging it is to get it right and manage the multitude of risks effectively.
So we've peeled back the layers on a really challenging aspect of international engagement, drawing directly from the analysis presented in the material you provided. We've seen the strategic risks, those kind of baked into the very nature of authoritarian systems and their security structures,
Risks of irrelevance, failure, reputational damage.
that you largely have to accept politically if you choose to engage at all.
And we've explored the operational risks, those related to faulty design, the type of support, the sensitivity of the topic, which the analysis suggests might be managed with incredible skill, political savviness, and adherence to known good practices.
But which often remain high because those practices aren't consistently followed for various reasons.
Exactly, and we saw how this analysis provides a framework, those 5 layers, to actually try and assess these complex risks in a structured way.
Okay, so here's something to chew on, maybe, based on the complexities and the pretty significant risks we've just explored together. Given those deep-seated strategic risks, layer 1 and 2, that seems so hard to avoid when working with systems fundamentally built on repression and regime survival. How can external support genuinely hope to bridge that gap between the regime's security priorities and the people-centered outcomes that are necessary for any real long-term stability in these countries? Is it even possible most of the time?
That's the fundamental tension, isn't it?
It seems like it. And what level of strategic risk should democracies truly be willing to accept in the pursuit of their own interests or values? And ultimately, can operational skill, even the best program design, ever truly compensate for working within structures that are fundamentally built on repression?
Deep questions. Keep thinking about them as you encounter news about international affairs and foreign policy decisions.
This has been The Deep Dive.